Okay, so here we are, another situation where an athlete is in the media for being involved in a domestic violence incident. And even though athletes aren't more likely to be involved in those incidents than non-athletes, when this does happen, it's big news. It's also very common when people hear about domestic violence for them to generate an image in their head of what they think this looks like. And the stereotype of domestic violence tends to be this man who comes home from work wearing a wife beater t-shirt and having a six-pack of beer, getting drunk and spontaneously beating up his girlfriend. And while that sometimes happens, that's not the dynamic that happens most often. And what I'm going to talk to you over the next few minutes about is that if you find yourself in one of these situations, that you're in a volatile relationship, they tend not to end well. So if you find that that's what's going on, you need to end it. The only way you win this is not to play. So what actually happens most often in domestic violence is it tends to be low-level and bidirectional. What that means is that both parties, man and woman, are arguing back and forth. And by the way, let me just say that the idea that this is only a heterosexual dynamic is not true. It happens in homosexual relationships as well. But what tends to happen is that you have this dynamic where the man and the woman are arguing back and forth, and men as a whole tend to not be as socially sophisticated as women. And so as the argument unfolds and it escalates, men at some times, and for some of us, will get to a level that we're extremely frustrated, very angry, and it then spills over into the physical. And by the way, it's also true that it's not uncommon in these escalations that sometimes the women will be physically violent as well. Why do men react this way? One of the reasons is that we really have problems with self-esteem. You know, the difference between men and women when it comes to self-esteem issues is that society tends to expect women to have low self-esteem, but we tend to be very fragile. And what we respond to most commonly is when someone takes a dig at our manhood. So if we're in a relationship and they push our buttons, or if they make us look silly amongst a bunch of our friends, it's not just feeling invalidated in the relationship, it's also like our pride is at stake and we have to defend it. Why is this so important? Because it doesn't do any good to just from the outside say, this happened, he hit her, and that's the end of it. He's bad, she's good, and everything's fine. If we want to prevent these things from happening and help athletes from preventing this, we need to be honest about the experience. We need to be honest that there are going to be times in relationships where things get heated, and that we need to know how to identify how we feel, and if we can't calm ourselves down, get out of this situation. Because if it gets to the point of domestic violence that one person hits another person, the man's going to be wrong every single time. I would ask you to consider it this way. It's kind of like big guy, little guy thing. If you have a big guy and a little guy in a fight, the little guy always wins. Why? Because if the little guy wins, he took down the champ. And if the big guy wins, then he was a bully. The only way you win is you don't fight. If you add alcohol to this, it could be the equivalent of throwing gasoline on a fire, because any restraint that you might be able to have is much more compromised when everybody involved is drinking. So, very complicated issue. I think it's important that we talk about it more, because if you do have a situation, everybody's going to know about it.